Hey everybody, Uncle Josh here. Welcome to Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories, Volume 17. If you have a scary story that you would like to share with me, please send it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. Let's begin. It Could Have Been Me, by Rin. I know from past experiences that I have a heightened sensory awareness when compared to my peers. I grew up always being aware of moods of people in rooms and picked up on things that my siblings didn't, and as I got into young adulthood, I realized that I could feel distrust and dishonesty just from a handshake or being near a person that appeared above board on the outside, but was bad underneath. I had the knack of feeling other life forms around me too, and that comes into play here. These are a couple of my experiences I want to share with you. One time, my husband and I had gone for a very long bike ride and came home, showered, and then settled in for the night. We lived in a 2-story house that had 2 bedrooms on either side of the stairs on the second floor. My baby was asleep in one room, and our bedroom was just around the corner on the left. We fell into a deep sleep, and at 4 a.m., I sat up straight in my bed and looked around. I had no idea why I was awake, but I felt extremely uneasy. I shook my husband and told him that something was wrong and he needed to go downstairs and look around. The horrible feeling in my gut wasn't going away, and again I poked him and told him to get up. He said, "Go back to sleep, honey. It's 4 a.m. and it's storming. You probably heard a tree limb hitting the house or something, and that's what woke you up." Now, there was a heavy wind and I could hear rain, so I reasoned that okay, he could be right. I lay there for a little while, but suddenly had an uncontrollable urge to run across the hall and grab my 10-month-old son and put him in bed with me. I got up to get him, and thought to myself, okay, if the hubby won't bother to go around the house, I won't either. So with baby in arms in my bed, I fell back asleep. A few hours later, I awoke to my husband shaking me and apologizing for his lack of response in the wee hours. He told me that our house had been broken into in the night. Someone had broken the window of his car and taken the garage opener and gotten into the garage. They stole our bikes and all of our tools, but he said when they entered the house, he found a crowbar and a hammer that they had left on the floor. They must have heard me wake up and ran out of the house. The next experience came a few years later, and we had moved to a city that I was unfamiliar with. Unfortunately, not long after we got there, we had trouble, and I left my husband and moved into another house. I took both of my sons with me, who were now 4 and 6. My house was situated on a deep cul-de-sac. I was cooking dinner in the kitchen one night while the boys were playing, and I started getting that uneasy feeling. I felt it all through dinner and decided to walk outside to see if anything was going on. I looked at the house next door because I knew those people were on vacation, and everything appeared fine, but I still felt as if someone was watching me. I went back inside and started washing dishes. A little while later, I felt that intense feeling of impending doom, and it was so strong that I even felt sick to my stomach. So I turned off the kitchen light, and just as I started to walk out of the kitchen, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement outside of my window. I couldn't tell what it was, so I went out the back sliding glass door and peered through my tall wood fencing. In the middle of the street, sitting on top of a manhole, I could see a figure. It was a man dressed in black. I could see he had a bag with him, and I assumed he was staking out the house next door, as my neighbors were not home, as I mentioned. So I quietly went inside and called the police. A bit later, I was getting my kids to bed when a police car came down the road, and soon I heard a knock on my door. The police had me point to where the man was and asked for any other details I could give them. They said they were going to check out the house next door to make sure that no one had tried to break in. I felt relieved, so I went back to my reading bedtime stories to the boys. Not too long later, the phone rang again, so I went to answer it, and it was the police. They told me to remain calm, but to do exactly what they said. They wanted me to get the kids into the bathroom and lock the door, and wait till they got there. They had no time to go into details, but they did say I was in immediate danger. Apparently, another officer was on a beat next to my block, and came across a white van that was empty, but the back doors were open. The officer ran the license plates, and it belonged to a dangerous person from another county that was on the run. He had raped and tortured a woman, and that's why they were after him. When the police officer called it in, the other officers realized that the van butted up against my cul-de-sac. And there was no fast way back to my house, so they called to warn me and that they were on their way. While in the bathroom, I heard a noise in the house, but it was light clicking or taps, and I wasn't sure exactly what it was and figured maybe it was just settling of the house. I listened carefully, thinking perhaps it was the police trying to get to the front door and it was locked, but I know it wasn't locked. Again, I heard another noise, but it was coming from the direction of my bedroom. I had a strong sense that someone was in the house with me. I had no idea why the police had told me to go to the bathroom, and I really didn't like the idea of having no place to go, and was contemplating grabbing the kids and running to the car. But again, that feeling of a presence told me someone else was in the house. I laid on the floor and tried to look under the door, remaining calm and staying quiet. I was so afraid my kids would wake up and make noise. Finally, I heard the cop car outside, and then them at the front door banging on it. Then I heard them yell and running and lots of commotion downstairs, so I slipped out of the bathroom. There was a man in my house, and he ran from it and jumped my back fence. He got away that evening, but was caught a week later, thank God. The police, however, found a bag by the side of my house. Inside it was a bandana, tape, rope, and handcuffs. The same things this guy had used when he had previously raped and tortured his last victim. He had been watching me for hours, sitting in wait until it time to make his move, which I had foiled because of my intuition. I knew that something was wrong, and it prompted me to call the police. All the while I thought he was looking at the house next door. But no, he was looking at me. I'm glad we're all safe, and I'd like to thank the police for such fast action, and I'd also like to thank the gift that has been given to me by God. The Doppleganger Haunting. This has been an ongoing experience for my mother, sister, and me. We all have seen this thing, and the only way we can explain it is that it's my sister's doppelganger. Not many people look like my sister. She has very long red hair, so it's not hard to miss her, and you can't mistake her for someone else. This started in the fall of 2004, when I was in 6th grade, living in Florida. I was in my room trying to fall asleep when my door opened and my sister came in, or what I thought was my sister. I didn't have a nightstand at the time, so I just used a picnic cooler with a blanket over it. It had my alarm clock and some hairbrushes on it. My sister came over and was messing with my brushes, which I remember really made me mad because it was late and I was trying to sleep. I began yelling at her to get out of my room. She didn't say a word, but just abruptly turned and left. As I watched her leave, it seemed to me that she was walking funny. She walked at a very fast pace, with her head turned and hair all over her face, hiding her eyes and mouth. The next day, I confronted my sister about coming into my room in the middle of the night. She swore, in fact still swears to this day, that she was never in my room and had no idea what I was talking about. That was my first experience with her doppelganger. My mom and even my sister have seen it too. One day, about a year after my experience, my mom was at home while my sister and I were at school. We were old enough to wake up and get ourselves ready and make it to the bus stop without any help from our parents. My sister would wake up earlier than anyone else since her school started at 7:20 in the morning. From my understanding, she did in fact make it to school on time. Yet my mom swears up and down that she saw my sister walking around the house with a towel on her head, like she had just gotten out of the shower. My mom was so pissed that my sister missed the bus to school, she started yelling at her. Again, just as in my experience, this person was walking in a fast-paced manner, and my mother said she never saw her face. She was walking so fast, but my mom kept yelling at her, thinking she was going to have to drive my sister to school. When my mom followed her into another room, however, there was no one there. When my sister came home after school, and my mom had told her what had happened, my sister was puzzled because she really was at school. My mom thought she was losing her mind, and I don't believe I told my mom about my experience until after she saw it too. We both came to the conclusion that there had been something wrong with its face, and that's why it never let us see it. I believe there is something dead wrong with its eyes, but that's just my theory. We never felt threatened by it because at the time we really thought it was my sister. There was another time my sister saw this entity for herself, and I must say her experience was a little different. She was working as a shift manager at Pizza Hut. She was at the restaurant pretty early in the morning before all the other workers got there. She saw someone walking in the kitchen area. This person had long red hair, just like hers, and was also dressed in a Pizza Hut uniform, just like she was. My sister said she had a feeling of dread come over her, and she was really scared. She actually had to leave the building and wait for another employee to show up before she went back in. She was certain that it wasn't another employee, since she was the only one with red hair. She also confirmed that the doppelganger moved fast, and its face couldn't really be seen. It scared her to think that her doppelganger had finally found her and followed her to work. My sister firmly believes that if she looks the doppelganger in the face, she will somehow die. And that's just the feeling she gets from it, and that's why it scared her to know that it followed her to work. That was the last time any of us saw that thing. For a while. We didn't forget about it, but I guess we all thought maybe it couldn't find us anymore. But we were wrong. The most recent event happened last year. My sister and I are all grown up now. She's 26 and I'm 20, and we've since moved away from Florida. My mom and sister live on the same property in Kentucky, and I live in New York. This was a typical day for my mom. She was by the sink doing some dishes in her home, and there's a window right above the sink, and when she looked out of it, she saw my sister walking up the path to the front door wearing her work uniform. She expected to see my sister come through the door to finish getting ready for work, but this thing never came inside the house. An hour later, my real sister did arrive at my mom's house. She was still in her pajamas, so my mom questioned her about what had happened earlier. Like so many times before, my sister denied walking over there and told my mom she was still sleeping at the time this had all happened. She wasn't needed at work until a few hours later, so there was no reason for her to be in her uniform. They were both freaked out by that incident. We all thought the doppelganger had left since it had been years since anyone saw it, but somehow it found my sister again. I really don't know how to explain all of these events, and I'm not sure if it will ever leave my sister alone. I don't know what will happen if she looks this entity in the face, if anything, but I hope my sister never does. For now, though, it's been a while since any one of us has seen it, but that doesn't mean it isn't out there. The guy who wouldn't leave me alone. So, a little backstory. I met this guy when he moved to my town during my junior year of high school. I was with a friend of mine, and he seemed to like her. She told me she would go over to his house whenever she wanted someone to buy a cheap cigar for her, and he was 18 and could do it. And then my friend told me he was having a party and that she wanted me to come with her. I trusted her to protect me at the party, as long as she was sober. However, I doubted she would be sober the whole time, and she might possibly pass out. Lucky for me, I had just met a guy at school that I really liked. I figured I'd use this party as an excuse to text him and ask him to stay on the line with me while I was at the party. I went to these parties a few times. Eventually, I started dating the guy I met at school, and he wanted me to stop going to these parties. The guy who was throwing them started showing a strong interest in me instead of my friend. A little while after I stopped going, he moved away, and I didn't hear from him again for another year. When I graduated high school, the guy I was dating and I got pretty serious. He went into the Army, I got a job at the local gas station for the summer, and everything was going great, and we eventually got engaged. Then, one day, party guy comes back. He comes into the store with a few guys from my old class, but quickly ditches them in order to talk to me for nearly 2 hours while I was on the clock. My boss told him to leave me alone during my shift, and he called him my boyfriend multiple times. However, with my boss, English isn't his first language, so I had a problem explaining my situation to him. This guy was nowhere near my boyfriend. He then started coming to work every day asking if I was working that day, and if I was, he'd stay waiting for me to get on my shift. If I wasn't, he'd show up at my house. If I wasn't home or at work, he'd knock on my door and convince my mom that I promised to hang out with him so he could sit on my couch and wait for me to get home. My boss told him that he couldn't visit me at work unless his main reason for the trip was to buy something, and he didn't keep me from working anymore. I remember my boss pointing out to me that he was circling the gas station in his car one night. He asked me if I was getting picked up by him after my shift. And I told him I wasn't and that I was worried. He just laughed it off. Neither my boss or my mom understood how creepy this shit was. I would constantly come home to him sitting on my couch. I would tell my mom that he was stalking me and I didn't want him around. My mom was adamant that I had not hurt his feelings, and he said he obviously just had a little crush on me. He would talk to me for hours after work about how much he liked me and my sister. I would constantly tell him that I was engaged and didn't want to hang out with him because he was obviously flirting with me. Then he would say he was really there to see my sister, who was also in a committed relationship and didn't want him around either. He went back and forth, not paying attention to any of the fact that neither of us were interested in having anything to do with him. I didn't talk to my fiancé about it because he was all the way in Florida, and there was nothing he could do about it anyway. I told him about my problem with my mom and her drunk friends, and he offered to take some kind of emergency leave and come and get me before he finished secondary training, but I didn't want that. I knew that telling him about this guy would add to the pile, so I didn't. After 2 months of staying far away from work or home whenever I could, I finally decided to take up my father-in-law's offer to come live with him until my fiancé got out of training. I didn't tell my mom or my stalker where I was going. I stayed up all night packing my stuff and took my car to my father-in-law's house. I privated all my social media and blocked my stalker and all his friends. Then, a few months later, my fiancé and I got married and moved far, far away from that place. I still haven't talked to him about it a lot. However, I know that creeper has no way to come here and find me, so I guess it doesn't matter. The Day My Father Met the Devil by Santos R. This is a story my father told me about the day he met the devil. It took place in Juarez, Mexico in the year 1942. My father was 20 years old at the time, and it was a story he told my brothers and I only a couple of times. It was very disturbing, and it's been a haunting memory for him. It was in the early evening on a summer's day. The circus had arrived in town, and my father and his younger brother, my uncle, went to check it out. There was always lots of pretty girls at these traveling fairs, but my father wanted to see the freak shows. He was always fascinated with the Elastic Man, the cow with two heads, the singing chicken, and all the other weird attractions these people provided. This time it was kind of a disappointment. There were the usual presentations, but nothing new, and some of the acts were obviously fake. But they did meet two girls, and were getting ready to go hear some live music, when they ran into a short, stubby man wearing a dinner jacket who started talking to them. This stranger introduced himself and started talking about the freak shows. Then he raised his arm and exclaimed that he was the greatest illusionist in the world. He said he had a trick that was both scary and amazing. My father asked him if he was part of the circus. The man shook his head. He said he auditioned for a job, but the owner turned him down. My father asked him why. The man said that his act was so frightening, the owner accused him of being the devil. Well, now my father and uncle were intrigued. They asked the man if they could see the trick. The man said of course, but they would have to come to the trailer where he lived. There he would show them. The man said his trailer was not far away. My father and uncle and the two girls followed the stranger until they arrived at the place. There were some steps leading up to the front door. The man showed them in, and they sat down on a sofa. The trailer was a good sized and well kept. After turning up the lights so his guests could see better, the stranger put on a cape, commenced with an introduction, bowed, held up his right hand, then proceeded to put on a white glove. He extended the arm and started running his left hand over and under and around his gloved right hand, all the time closing and opening it, wiggling the fingers. He started chanting some strange words in another language. Then, with his left hand, he grabbed the tip of the white glove, turned and looked at my father, and asked him and the others if they were ready. They said yes, and with a quick motion he removed the glove. My father was in shock and disbelief, and so was my uncle. The girls screamed. There, staring him in the face, was a skeleton hand wiggling its fingers. He turned the hand around so they could see the back, and my father said it had to be real. And then my uncle got up to get a closer look. And that's when the man grabbed the top of my uncle's head with his bony hand and said that now he was really going to show them something. And that was all it took. The girls ran out the door screaming and crying, followed by my father and uncle. The man came out of the door yelling and laughing. My father stopped and turned around to look at him. The stranger was standing there at the top of the steps with a grin on his face looking at my father. On the ground was a wooden plank with long nails pointing up. The man jumped off the steps and landed right on the nails. They went right through his shoes and blood started to flow. My father stood there transfixed. The man started to laugh again and pointed at my father with his bony finger. My uncle came back, grabbed my father by the arm, and both of them ran. My father and uncle knew that was the devil, and they were so grateful they were able to escape. It's a day he'll never forget and hasn't. Whether or not it was just a grand circus show, it's still a creepy and messed up story. That's not your mother, son. My dad lived with his mom, dad, brother, and 3 sisters on a farm in a small county before they moved to California. At the time, he was around 8 or 9 years old. They didn't have a television, and the town was pretty far to drive to, much less walk. There was never much to do, and my dad recounted one day sitting on the porch of their house, drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick. My grandfather was sitting next to him playing the harmonica, and my grandmother was cooking dinner in the kitchen. The screen door was open, and she was in plain sight. My father was still somewhat at a tender age, and wanted to follow Grandma everywhere she went. He was never ever too far behind her. So it startled him when he looked up from his stick drawing to see her walking towards the outhouse. They obviously didn't have indoor bathrooms. He ran after her without hesitation, trying to catch up. And he was yelling, "Mommy, Mommy, wait for me! Where are you going?" She continued walking with no response, as if she didn't hear him. She walked in and shut the door behind her, and my father came to the outhouse and banged loudly on the closed door. He was feeling rejected by her ignoring him, and he began to cry. "Why didn't you wait for me, Mommy? Why, Mommy?" Again, remember, he was just a kid. No response. Defeated, he sat against the door with his head in his knees. And just as he was calming down, he looked up to see his mother once more. This time, she was walking towards the garage. Because he was already so distraught, he didn't think about how she got out of the outhouse without him noticing. Instead, he chased her once more. This time, Grandpa yelled at him, "Dan, where are you going? Get back here! Stay away from that! Get back here now!" My dad ignored the warnings, saying, "I'm following Mommy." He followed his mother into the garage, and when he looked around, he saw that she was sitting in the front seat of the car, with her back to him. He immediately got in the back seat and shut the door after him. It was silent except for his sniffling. "Mommy, are you mad? Why didn't you wait for me?" Again, no response. He didn't look up to see her face. She was sitting unnaturally still, and just as my dad was about to tap her on her shoulder, he saw Grandpa come quietly towards the side door. When their eyes met, Grandpa put his finger to his mouth in the shush motion. He opened the door, staring more at the figure in the front seat than my father, and then he grabbed my dad and ran out of the garage, holding his hand to my father's mouth the entire time. My dad kicked and screamed until my grandpa put him down on the porch once more. "Why did you do that? I want to talk to Mommy. Leave me alone." My grandpa yelled, "That's enough." Then he softened. "That's not Mommy." My father was confused and looked towards where my grandfather was pointing. His finger was jabbing through the door in the direction of the kitchen, where Grandma was still cooking dinner. My dad saw the apparition from time to time going from the fields to the outhouse or to the garage where it would do odd things. He would see it standing in a corner or facing a wall, but he never chased after it again. He said he often wonders what would have happened had that thing turned around, because like Grandpa said, that's not Mommy. Freaky Shrieking in the Woods. I was 18 years old and had recently killed my first deer. Dad and I had taken his old truck and found our way to a nice secluded spot, where we parked it in a new clear cut in the early afternoon. The cut was narrow there, with one side against a thick mass of young pine trees, and the other side abutting a thin strip of mature pine trees. On the far side of the mature pines were some more thick young pines. Dad and I took our climbing stands and walked to the mature pines and through them. A dim trail ran along the opposite edge of them. Dad went to the right, and I went to the left. I found a likely-looking spot, set up my climbing stand, and climbed up the tree. As usual, I sat in my stand and waited for a deer to show up for a long time. The day waned, shadows grew longer, and the woods got still as evening pressed closer. Not a leaf was moving, as if there was no breeze. It was a magic time to be out there in the woods, and I was full of anticipation that something was about to happen. Then, something did. All of a sudden, I heard some noises indicating that something was moving nearby. I quickly looked in that direction, but all I saw was a bush waving, showing that it had been recently disturbed. How the critter had gotten past me without being seen was a bit mysterious, but animals get past hunters all the time, so that was only mildly freaky. It was still strange, though. Suddenly, the peace of the forest was sundered by a blood-curdling shriek, one of the most primal and heart-stopping cries I have ever heard. Then came another shriek, just as ominous as the first. Some more ruckus in the brush, too. That noise was just ethereal and hard to nail down. My heart froze and shrank. My eyes bulged in their sockets, and every hair on my body did its best imitation of a cactus spine. I clenched my .44 carbine rifle more tightly, wondering how effective it might be against enemies from hell. I tried to simultaneously shrink to invisibility and expand to monster-threatening proportions. I trembled in my tree, my movements and expressions defining the word furtive. A problem. Freaky stuff happening. I'm all alone. It's getting dark. There's crazy shrieking between me and the truck. I don't have a flashlight. Guns don't kill demons, and I'm up a tree. Solution? Run. Well, I'm not certain that I actually ran, but I won't say that I didn't. I do know that I came down that tree and left my stand to be retrieved in the daylight, and I wasted no time getting out of the woods to the truck. Dad hadn't even heard it, which seemed even more eerie at the time. His suggestion was that it was probably a cottontail rabbit being killed by a predator. Apparently, rabbits sometimes scream horribly in blood-curdling fashion. Right now I am safely inside and on my own property, and 26 years have passed since that happened. I still get goosebumps in a case of the heebie-jeebies when I think of that screech. It seemed to be part human, part animal, part spirit, but something about it was completely evil. All I know for sure is that when I went back to get my stand during daylight hours, that was the last time I was there. The Pool Boy. I can assure you that this is 100% true. I've never told the story to anyone, not even my wife. Why? I don't know why. I guess I just wanted to keep it to myself. My parents divorced when I was 9 years old, and about 2 years later, around 1979, my father remarried a very nice woman, and they purchased a house together. The house that they bought was your typical single-story Californian stucco suburban tract house from the mid-60s. It was clean, airy, well-lit, and cheerful. And it had this great pool dominating much of the large backyard. It was just about the last place you would expect anything to be haunted. I lived with my mother and spent about every other weekend with my father and stepmother. I loved that. My dad's house had a rec room with a pool table and a full bar, but the best thing was the swimming pool. I mean, it was complete with a slide and a diving board. My father decided that if I liked the pool so much, it would be my job to keep it and the surrounding patio clean. I really didn't mind, since the pool had a great filter and sweeping system. My job was mainly to skim the leaves and junk off the surface, and put away all the towels and pool toys before I went to bed. The first strange occurrence happened around the third or fourth weekend I stayed there. My bedroom window looked out over the patio and pool itself, and I woke one night to the sound of splashing. It didn't sound like people were swimming, but more like someone was tossing something into the pool, or something had fallen in. I got up and looked out the window, but I saw nothing. In fact, the surface of the pool was dead calm. I didn't give it any more thought and went back to bed. The next weekend, I heard the same splashing noises, and this time I crept out of bed and went to our back door on the patio. Once again, there was nothing or nobody out by the pool, and the water was still as glass. I just figured I'd imagined the noises and went back to bed. Early the next morning, my father called me out to the backyard and asked me why I hadn't taken all the toys out of the pool when I cleaned up the night before. I told him I did. He then took me to the edge of the pool and pointed to the bottom of the deep end. There, at the bottom, were 4 diving rings. They're hard plastic rings about 7 inches around that you throw into the pool, and they sink to the bottom, and then you dive for them. I told my dad that I specifically remember retrieving them with the skimmer net the night before. My dad told me, hey, look, you gotta be more careful, because if you leave them in the pool, they're gonna disturb the pool sweep's pattern. Which, to this day, I still think is bullshit. Anyway, I figured that I had just forgotten and didn't dwell on it. But the next weekend, the same thing happened. I took special care to remove everything from the pool and store them on the patio Friday night. Yet Saturday morning, the diving rings were back at the bottom of the deep end. At first, I thought someone was playing a joke on me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it was impossible to gain access to the backyard unless you went through the house. There was an 8-foot cinder block wall surrounding the yard, and both gates were padlocked to prevent neighborhood kids from wandering into the pool. Throughout that summer, every time I put the diving rings on the patio, they ended up in the pool the next morning. It happened so much that my dad finally stopped chewing me out about it. Other things happened as well. Inflatable pool toys like rafts and beach balls would be fine when I put them away, but in the morning, they would be deflated. Not punctured, but the plugs were pulled out, and all of their air was squeezed out, I guess. Of course, I asked my dad and stepmom if they had done any of these things, and they just gave me a look like I was on drugs. I never mentioned any of these things to them again. One Friday night after about 2 years of these occurrences, I had a brainstorm. I took my bicycle lock and chain and ran the chain through the diving rings and chained them all to the patio support pole. I figured there was no way anybody would be able to remove the rings and put them into the pool. I was the only living soul who knew the combination to that lock. The next morning, I nearly shit my pants when I went outside. I saw that while the chain was still around the pole and the lock was still closed, the rings were not on the chain anymore. It took every ounce of my courage to go to the edge of the pool and look down. Sure enough, there were the rings at the bottom. Needless to say, I was freaked out beyond belief. I fished the rings out, and I took them into an alley behind the house and threw them into a storm drain, hoping to be rid of them forever. After the bike lock incident, I rarely went to the pool alone. At this point, I should say that I never told anyone about the strange things happening around the pool, mainly because I was just a teenager and feared being branded as a nutcase. My parents would have thought I was drinking or stoned, so I just kept my mouth shut. The straw that broke the camel's back came towards the end of August of 1982. A friend and I were swimming one afternoon when he excused himself to go inside and use the bathroom. I still felt creepy being alone in the pool, so I swam to the ladder in the deep end and started to haul myself up. As I was climbing out with my back to the pool, I heard 4 distinct small splashes. I turned around and watched as 4 diving rings sank to the bottom of the pool. These were the same rings I had thrown into the sewer nearly a year before. There was no one in the backyard, and my friend was still inside. I just sat there, paralyzed with fear. There is no way any living thing could have caused the rings to fall in the pool. My friend came out about a minute later, and I asked him if he had thrown them in. He kind of laughed and said, "What rings?" I showed him the rings at the bottom of the pool, and he said, "When did you guys get those?" Now, my friend was generally a very serious person and never played practical jokes. I asked him again and made him swear to tell me the truth. He looked at me and could tell I was serious. Again, he replied, "No." I told him we were done swimming, and then he followed me into the house. I then told him about all of the things that had happened over the last 3 years. He just sat there slack-jawed. He didn't say I was nuts. He didn't tell me to stop bullshitting him. He just listened. I knew he believed me. It was late, and he needed to go home, so we both reluctantly went back out to the pool to retrieve our sandals and t-shirts, which we had left on a table on the patio. I can admit today without any shame that I peed in my swimsuit when I looked into the pool and saw our sandals and shirts floating on top of the water. And the rings were no longer at the bottom of the pool, nor anywhere else. That fall, my eldest stepsister announced that she and her husband were going to have a baby. My dad shelled out the big bucks and had a wrought iron safety fence installed around the pool. That way people could enjoy the patio and yard and not have to worry about his new step-grandbaby wandering into the pool. Since no one used the pool in the winter, there were never any toys or accessories to put away. But I still had to skim the pool when I stayed over. After the safety fence was installed, I never noticed anything strange. And the next spring and summer, all the inflatable rafts stayed inflated overnight, and I never heard any splashing sounds again. I didn't give it much thought over the next few years. I was just glad the creepy stuff had stopped, and I was grateful. When I turned 18, I no longer had to stay with my dad on weekends, and eventually moved out of my mother's house in with some friends of mine. I was also going to college, and one day I had to do some research on a local election for a poli-sci class. I went to our local library and asked the research librarian for the microfilm of our local paper from November of 1978. I started to scan through the film, looking for the articles that I needed, when I realized the clerk had given me the film for October and not November. I was just about to rewind the film and get to the correct roll, when a small headline caught my eye. Tot drowns in accident. To this day, I have no idea where I found the strength to not scream when I read the accompanying article. It said that a 3-year-old boy who was visiting his aunt and uncle had unlocked a door and wandered into a backyard swimming pool and drowned. The first thing I noticed was the address where this had occurred. It was my father and stepmother's house. The poor kid had died about half a year before my parents had moved in. His name was Ricky. I just sat there reading the article over and over. I then knew who or what had been causing all the strange things to happen at that pool. I made a copy of the article and left the library without finishing my research. I went straight to my dad's house and showed him and my stepmother the article. My dad said, "Well, we knew about this when we bought the house, but we didn't want to scare you." Scare me? I nearly broke a blood vessel laughing so hard. I couldn't believe it. My dad asked me what was so funny, and I almost told him about all the stuff that had freaked me out all those years before. But I figured, what was the use? I then excused myself and went out into the backyard. For the first time in many years, I didn't feel afraid when I looked out at the pool. I figured Ricky finally stopped his antics when my dad put the safety fence up. Maybe Ricky felt at peace knowing the pool was now safe. I sat down on one of the patio chairs and just watched the water. After about 10 minutes, I got up to leave. Just before I opened the patio door, I turned to the pool and said goodbye to Ricky. Do You Want a Lift? By Medium. This was the late 90s, and me and a friend were over at another friend's house. We were both around 17 or 18. Around midnight, we both set off home, and we typically walked everywhere as neither of us drove. It was really our only option. We walked part of the way back together and then split off in our separate directions. He lived out in the country, and the walk back to his house was a long and pretty vacant one. A very long stretch of main road past a cemetery, followed by an almost pitch-black walk down a 1-mile road which led to his village. His house was the second house of the village, so after that trek, he'd be home. After splitting up, it took about 10 minutes before I got a call from him. He said a guy had pulled up next to him in a car and said, "Hey, do you want a lift?" His initial reaction was confusion. He didn't know this guy, but also his car was full of kids. 4 kids ranging from age 5 to 14. He said he told him that he was fine, and the guy's face just changed and he shouted, "Yeah, well, you didn't fucking look like you needed one." At that point, he sped off. As he was explaining this, he says, "Oh, fuck, he's here again." I immediately turned on heel and started walking back. I partly hear the conversation on the phone. The guy pulls up alongside him again and says, "You want a fucking lift now?" My friend again responds with, "No." Then, possibly the weirdest point of all of this, the guy says, "Are you a hermaphrodite?" My friend, confused, just said, "What?" To which the guy responded, "Do you have both male and female organs?" To which my friend simply responded, "No." And the guy took off in his car again. At this point, I'm racing to catch up to where he'd got to. He was just past the cemetery on the long main road before he got to the point where he'd turn off onto the mile of dark road. On catching up with him, he was visibly freaked out. He said the weirdest part is that the kids in the car just seemed unfazed by it. Like this guy just does this kind of thing and they're used to it. They weren't laughing. They weren't even really paying attention. It was just all so bizarre. We started walking together and got to the mile of dark road. It's not a nice place to walk at the best of times, and the previous events just made us both more nervous. We pressed on. About halfway down the path, we hear a car coming up from behind us. It's the guy again. He's absolutely racing down the road and comes to a screeching halt right next to us. Again, he winds the window down. I clock the guy, and he looks like the most typical early 30s chav dad at the time. Bleach blonde Eminem-style hair, football top. Basically, you wouldn't have looked twice at him in the street in that particular era. He eyes me up and says, "Who the fuck's this?" Before either of us can say a word, he screams, "Do you want to fucking fight?" And again, before even answering that question, he takes off again, speeding down the road into the village where my friend lives. We now had to walk directly toward where he'd gone, so we sprint it, knowing his house isn't so far away. We rush into his house and stake out his bedroom window, which looks out over the only road leading out of the village. No car left in the hour we sat there. This guy must live in the village, we concluded. I stayed at my friend's house that night, and early next morning we went looking for the car. This village is made up of about 4 separate cul-de-sacs, and we could see no sign of the vehicle. Whether it was parked in a garage or not, who knows, but it all started to feel like an episode of The Twilight Zone. So weird, angry child convoying football hooligan? Let's never meet again. The Shack Behind My Grandparents' House by Wolf the Drummer. A few years ago, I went to visit my grandparents. They live in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a lot of woods. Behind their house is a shack, and of course behind the shack is nothing but those woods. My grandfather told me that they would see lights in the woods at midnight sometimes, but they never investigated. At the moment there was daylight, so I thought I'd do some exploring, and I walked around the woods to see if I could find anything. I did. In a clearing, I found 16 big black candles, and for some reason I started kicking them down, and then headed back to the house. I asked my grandma where I was going to sleep, and she said I could sleep in the shack. I was actually pretty excited because when I went inside, there was a bed, a TV, a PS3, and some games. Now, the shack only had one door, which was facing my grandparents' house, and it also had 2 windows on each side of the door, but one of them had an AC unit bolted to it, and the other window had small curtains covering it. I was playing some Call of Duty when my grandmother called me for dinner. I finished eating, and it was getting late, so I thought I'd just go back to the shack and crash. My grandma told me to knock on her window if I needed to use the restroom, and to lock the shack door when I went to sleep. I was watching TV for a while, and I got sleepy, but I remember getting up and locking the door, and then went to the bed and fell asleep. I had left the TV on. I had a dream where some girl was knocking on the window, and she told me to open the door. I unlocked it and then went back to lying on the bed, and then I woke up in a cold sweat. I checked the door, and it was unlocked. I was a little freaked out by this, but I quickly locked it again. I looked out the window, and all I could see was the light from my grandparents' back porch. I went to lay down on the bed again with my arms wide open and one arm hanging off the bed. Again, I fell into a deep sleep and dreamed I was really tired, as if I had just run for miles non-stop. Again, I opened my eyes and saw nothing but darkness, and for some reason the TV was off. I couldn't move my body. It wasn't like I was paralyzed, I was just unbelievably tired. My eyes started to adjust to the darkness, and I heard something to my left where my arm was hanging. And that's when I felt it. Someone or something had a really tight grip on my forearm. Then they would release their grip, and then grip it really hard again. I slowly turned to look at my arm, and there was the same girl who told me to open the door in my dream. She was on her knees, and she had her lips on my wrist, and it seemed like she was sucking on it. She would suck every time she loosened her grip on my forearm. I felt so drowsy, and I remember saying, Hey, what are you doing?" She just looked up at me, but didn't say a word. After that, I just passed out. The next thing I remembered was my grandma opening the door and saying, "Are you going to sleep all day? And why didn't you lock the door?" I felt really tired. I asked her what time it was, and she said it was 5 in the afternoon. "I left some chicken in the oven if you're hungry," she said. Then she closed the door. I tried to get up, but I felt a sharp pain in my entire arm. I looked at it, and on my wrist there was what seemed to be a large mosquito bite. It was bright red, and on my forearm was a giant bruise. And that's when I remembered the dreams. I felt like I was losing my mind, and I touched the red spots, and my entire arm hurt all the way to the back of my shoulder, even though I barely put any pressure on it. I didn't know if I should tell my grandparents what had happened or not, or about my dreams, or if that was even real. I slowly got up and went inside my grandparents' house, and they were both in the small living room watching TV. I decided to tell them about the candles I knocked down, and my grandma said black candles are bad, and that maybe some devil worshippers that used to live across the stream were back and were doing some bad things out there again. We all went to check out the clearing where the candles were, but there was no trace of them. I just wanted to leave. I asked them if they could take me home, but they said it was too late and that I would have to wait until the next day, which meant one more night in the shack. That night I didn't sleep. Every time I dozed off, I quickly woke up and looked all around the shack. Once the sun came up, I did fall asleep, and then I heard a knock on the door. I checked the window, and it was my grandpa. "You ready to go?" he yelled at the door. I packed up my stuff and left. Once we got back to my house, my grandma went inside, and right before my grandpa and I went in, I told him I needed to talk to him. I told him about the dream. I showed him the bruise and the red mark, and he just stared at me for a while. Then he said he thought maybe it was an evil spirit. He went on to say that he's seen some strange things in the woods, and that they have heard footsteps on the roof a dozen times, but they never figured out what it was. He also told me they tried blessing the house, but nothing happened. But maybe that was just a waste of time, as the paranormal things usually happened outdoors and never inside. A couple of days later, the red mark went away, but I had the bruise for about a week. Once in a while, I still dream about that girl, and I want to know who she is, but she always disappears when I dream about her. I honestly don't know what she was or if she was even human. I don't think it was a succubus, because I've read succubus has sexual relations with the person. The experience I had was nothing sexual. Just felt like I was very tired, and she was sucking on my wrist. The edge of town. Where I grew up as a child, behind our house was the end of town. It was nothing but open valley floor and sparse patches of forest. I was always a very explorative child, a trait I got from my dad, and I constantly found myself spending my summers exploring all the land behind our house. There was an open field about 2 miles from my parents' house that had 3 very large oak trees that formed a peculiar triangle. I had been there many times before, and with each visit, there was this odd odor that hung in the air. The odor was only inside the large triangle of trees, and I later in life found out what that smell was. It was death. One of the last times I ever made my way to those trees was when I stumbled upon a pile of dead ducks. There must have been at least 50 or 60 of them in the middle of the 3 trees. I didn't know where they came from or who put them there. There weren't any lakes close by, and no roads led to this site. It wasn't until my late teens that I saw a similar pile of dead ducks out in the canals that border my hometown. I came to find out from a friend that it was some sort of local cult that performed the killings and piled up the ducks. My second experience took place a mile or so away from the oak trees. It was an abandoned farm that I visited only one time. On the property was a white 2-bedroom farmhouse with a wraparound porch, an old dinner bell. It had red trim and lots of windows. Adjacent to the house was a very dilapidated barn. As I entered the house, what appeared to be a hunter came walking around the corner from the kitchen, a rifle in hand. He was just over 6 feet tall and had short brown hair, a mustache and beard, and was dressed in a plaid long-sleeve shirt, jeans and boots. He was very nice and introduced himself as Jim, and said that he was hunting rabbits in the area. He began to tell me about the house, the barn, and the family that lived there. He said the family just up and abandoned the farm one day and were never seen again. They left all their belongings and took nothing with them. and this was clearly evident in the house. We walked out to the barn where he showed me old black and white photos of the farm and family. I couldn't believe everything was just left behind. Well, we said our goodbyes, and he invited me and my parents to join him and his wife for dinner sometime. He said you could see his house from behind the barn, and that it was only a couple of miles away. As I was walking away from the barn, I got this nagging feeling. Something in my head was telling me to go back to that house and look around some more. I went back and snooped around for a little while. I realized Jim was gone, and I looked all over the place, outside and in the barn. I walked behind the barn to see if I could see Jim walking back home, but there was no one there. Nobody was around. I looked in the direction that Jim had told me he lived, and there was no house there. There was nothing. A couple of days later, I decided to look for Jim's house. And I found it all right, or at least where a house once stood. All that was left was a burnt-out foundation. There was nothing else around the area, just fields and low grass. And lastly, because I was just a kid and had to share these stories and places with my dad, we went out one weekend so I could show him what I found. I took him to the 3 oak trees and confirmed to him the smell of death in the area, and we went to the abandoned farm, followed by a short walk to the burnt-out foundation. My dad was very intrigued by all of this because he had similar, albeit much more frightening experiences when he was my age. We ran into some Union Pacific Railroad tracks and decided to take them in a roundabout way back home. On our way, we found another abandoned, or so we thought, shanty. We started walking towards it. When about 50 yards from the front door, every fiber in my being was screaming at me to stop. Even my dad got a little stiff-legged, and before I said anything, he told me we should just leave this one alone. I could never make myself go anywhere near that shanty run-down place. I've been out there a couple of times since, and it's still standing. And to this day, I still can't get close to it. The feelings get so overwhelming sometimes that I can't even stand to look at the structure. I don't know why, but as the older I've gotten, I feel like I'm just not wanted out there on the edge of town. Creepy Cook at a Fast Food Place by Jarful of Painkillers. I was 20 years old at the time, and I was working at a Chinese food place in the mall. I don't know if any of you have ever wondered, but all the restaurants in a mall's food court are connected by a long hallway behind them that only mall employees are allowed access to. Due to only workers going there, and for it being hidden, you can imagine that the place is pretty solitary. This is important because this is where the events took place. Now on to the story. There was this cook in the restaurant, for whose anonymity's sake I'll refer to as Greg. Greg was Chinese and didn't speak Spanish, my native language, nor English, only Mandarin. He only understood certain words in Spanish, like rice, noodles, chicken, and other food items that he cooked, so that when we yelled him into the kitchen, he knew what to bring out. Also, I don't know how old he was, but he was easily over 60. So, Greg, despite the language barrier, was a very bubbly person. Ever since I started working there, I noticed how he always made silly noises when he came up front to deliver his food, and all the other girls would laugh. He generally seemed very sweet and friendly, and I never heard any of the girls complain about him at all. For all I could tell, he was just friendly with everyone, and harmless. With time, as I stopped being the new girl, Greg would become comfortable around me, too, and make beep-beep noises when he came to the front to deliver food as his way of asking me to step out of the way. It was actually kind of cute, and all my other coworkers, like I said, found him pretty harmless, so I began to feel comfortable around him, too. A couple of months into the job, I was already familiar with everyone in the staff, Greg included, so I would always wave hello or goodbye to him, and he'd give me a smile and wave back. I never thought anything weird of our interactions because they were the same with everyone else he was interacting with. Until one day, I was getting back to my shift after my break. I pushed through the employee door to enter the long hallway I mentioned earlier. You could hear noises from the other workers inside their respective restaurants, but no one was really outside in the hall. As I was walking towards the restaurant I worked at, I saw that Greg was just then getting out for his break. He immediately smiled and said my name in the thick accent he always said it with, and I smiled back at him. I didn't feel at all threatened because, like I've probably mentioned a million times by now, he had never given me reason to feel threatened. He's still smiling at me, standing in front of the entrance to my job, so I couldn't really just walk past him. Just as I was nearing him, he extends his arms, basically asking me for a hug. I'd seen him hug the other girls before, so again, I thought nothing of it and went in for it. Call me naive. At first it was all fine and dandy, but my shift was about to start, so I had to go. He had been hugging me for a bit too long as well, so not only was I getting antsy, but also uncomfortable. I broke the hug and tried to push him back gently, signaling to him that I needed to go. And this is when I began to panic. You see, when I tried to push him away, he actually held me tighter and wouldn't let go. I was confused, so I tried to push against him again, and this time a bit more obviously. But he held on even more, pressing me against him. This is when I realized my naivete caused me to make a huge mistake. I turned my head to glare at him, but the moment I did, he leaned down as if expecting me to look, tried to kiss me. Okay, now I was really freaking out, because this was the first time someone had tried to come at me so aggressively, and he didn't speak any of the languages I spoke, so I didn't know how to tell him to let me go other than with actions. And before you yell at me for not screaming, at the time I was so shocked that I didn't even think of it. I kind of shut down in that department, and instead tried to figure out a way to make him let me go. All this time, as I'm thinking about what the fuck to do, he's still trying to kiss me, keeping me in place no matter how much I struggled, and actively following my head with his lips to try to plant one on me. It didn't matter if we didn't speak the same language. I think it was obvious I wasn't comfortable, so I can't say that he didn't know what he was doing. It was clear that he wasn't going to let me go until I kissed him. So I did what I first thought of. I stopped moving my head and somehow managed to gather enough courage to look him right in the eye. I saw him lean in again for my lips, and I pretended I was going to let him kiss me. And then, literally, at the last second, I turned my head to the side to try and make him kiss my cheek instead. It sort of worked. I wasn't fast enough, for I still felt his lips peck the corner of my mouth. I felt disgusted, but at least it wasn't what he wanted. Just as I hoped, as soon as he planted one on me, he broke the hug, holding me at arm's length and gave me this huge grin. He then patted my shoulder before finally letting me go and walking away. I stood there shaken, not really knowing what to do. Eventually I went back to work, but my coworkers asked me if I was okay since apparently I was pale as paper. My arms couldn't stop shaking. I just shrugged them off. I never reported this to my boss, nor did I say anything to my coworkers, partly because I thought the chef was family and they'd fire me rather than him, but mostly because I was stupid. However, I did avoid him at all costs for the remaining time I worked there, and never treated him the same. I also never went alone to the kitchen, nor entered the hallway until it was literally a minute for me to clock in. Eventually I quit and never returned to that place. I heard he also quit not long after I had. Well, whatever the case, good riddance, Greg. The Day I Met a Suspected Terrorist by I Am Not Spartan. I was reminded of a story today that took place in September 2010, according to the pictures from an old Flickr account. I grew up in a rural area, and there wasn't much to do unless you wanted to drive at least 35 minutes to the closest city. If you weren't up for the drive, one of the popular things to do was to watch sunsets by the large river that ran along the county line. One day, my best friend and I decided to go down to the river and take some pictures of the sunset. We drove through one of the towns and down a short yet steep road that opened up into a gravel parking lot. There was one other car there and no one else to be seen, so we figured we had lucked out. As a side note, people normally park and either walk along the river or take their boats out, so we didn't think anything of it. We started taking pictures of the river as the sun was setting, and I hopped onto the railroad tracks running parallel to the water to get a picture of an old railroad crossing sign. All of a sudden, this guy jumps out of a bush near the railroad tracks to let me know that a train is coming. I look over and see a train light in the distance, so I hop off the tracks and thank him for the warning. This guy looks like he was in his early 20s, and he was very handsome. He had olive skin, and if I had to guess, I would say he had some Middle Eastern heritage like me. His accent was thick and sounded like he was from some European country that I couldn't identify. I'd like to say that was the first thing I noticed, but no. It was the fucking sniper rifle he was holding in his hand, scope and everything. Now, I might not know much about guns, but I've played enough Call of Duty to know a sniper rifle when I see it. I look over at my friend and can tell she's getting nervous. The guy starts making small talk, asking us where we're from, and I didn't want to tell him I was from a few towns over, so I told him we were from the town we were in. I asked him where he was from, assuming he was going to tell me he was a student at the well-known liberal arts college down the road that attracts international students. Nope. He said he was visiting the area, and as he's talking, he's just casually spinning around the rifle in his hands. I start feeling like this guy could actually kill us. There was no one else around and the sun was setting. While I'm having a silent freakout, and I sense my friend is having the same thing, I start thinking up excuses to get the fuck out of there. My brain decided that the best solution was to tell him that I needed to meet my dad at the station because we were going out for dinner. He asked what my dad did, and I told him he was a cop. I figured that if he knew someone was expecting us, especially someone in law enforcement, he wouldn't try anything. He bought it, and we ran to the car and drove away as fast as possible. I don't know why, but I didn't even think to call the police. Instead, I just brushed it off as a creepy encounter. I didn't question why the guy was hiding in the bushes with a sniper rifle, when it wasn't large game hunting season. And plus, the area wasn't wooded enough for anyone to hunt there anyway. A week or so goes by, and I forgot about it. Until I saw the headline in the local paper. Police had caught a handful of suspected armed terrorists in their 20s. They were from places all over in Europe and were caught by the river in the same small town we had met the guy. I felt my stomach sink and couldn't finish the article. I didn't want to know if these guys were planning an attack, because I knew that I could have done something sooner. Edit. I texted my best friend to ask if she remembered this, and she said it actually took place in July of that year. I looked through our friendship on Facebook, and sure enough, she was right. The wall posts must have been from the day after. Anyway, this is the only proof I have since I wasn't stupid enough to take a pic of the guy holding the gun. Thanks for listening, gang. I hope you enjoyed these true scary stories from wherever they came from. Please check out my Patreon page. I am restructuring that, and again, not begging for cash, but if you want to help keep this channel rolling and bringing you the best in original content that you don't hear anywhere else, for the most part, check that out and find out how you can help support this channel. And also, please check out my live radio show, debuting this week rather than last week due to a flood I just had to deal with, on Sunday evening. 8 to 10 Eastern Time. Go to theedgeoftheunknown.com for more information and how you can listen live and interact with my guest, Sorcerer Ray Scott, as we talk about sorcery and witchcraft. Until next time, everybody, have a great night, great day, great afternoon, wherever you may be. And remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.